It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. 40 days on from that rain-soaked announcement, it's the last push for votes.
This is the final mile. These are the last hard yards, but the last steps are always the hardest.
We will fight for you. I will fight for you. I will make sure that your voice is heard.
We'll get the latest from out on the campaign trail. With the Lib Dem leader Ed Davey aiming for a bigger poll bounce. Also, will Labour's GB Energy really make Britain a clean energy superpower?
Unless Britain does this now, we'll be left behind across the world, so we've got to get on with this.
And I've been tracking down the young people who've become accidental election influencers on social media.
Joining us today, Conservative peer Stuart Jackson, Shadow Environment Secretary Steve Reed, the New Statesman's Harry Lambert and political strategist Jo Tanner. This is Politics Live, Election 2024. Yes, welcome. The final few days of the campaign. Well, following England's nail-biting victory against Slovakia last night, the Prime Minister tweeted this. There it is, Rishi Sunak, joy there. It's not over, he says, until it's over. My question to you, Stuart, is does the Prime Minister really believe the Tories can do an England?
I think he's a realist. I think his advisers in Downing Street will be aware that this has been a particularly difficult campaign and gruelling for him. He can read the polls like everyone else, but he's a leader. He's the Prime Minister until whenever, probably Friday. And he's got to lead from the front and be upbeat. He can't say, well, you know, it's all over, we've lost. He's got to keep going, energising, enthusing people and trying to persuade those maybe a couple of 100,000 voters who are tempted to vote Reform to come back to the Tories, because that could save 10, 15, 30 seats. Right. Let's show what Keir Starmer tweeted in response to the victory. Never in doubt, says the Labour leader, and you can see there Harry Kane and Jude Bellingham and that result. Does that also apply, Steve, to the result of the general election?
That applies to the England game. It doesn't apply to the general election. You know, the election isn't over like a football match until the whistle blows, and the whistle blows on the election at 10 o'clock on Thursday the 4th. So until that point, we do not know the result. And anyone that claims this is over, they know the result, it's all been won, absolute rubbish. Until people have got out there and cast their votes, we do not have a decision on the general election, and we won't know until the end of Thursday. What
do you make of the last few days, the setting here with the football last night in terms of what will happen on Thursday?
Well, I think one element of the election is over. We know that it's going to be a Labour landslide, and I think anyone that doesn't want to take that bet, I'd love to take it with them. But I think that the bit we don't know is the Reform-Tory split, and it's so decisive to what happens in the next government, what happens in the next few days, because we're within a margin of error of Reform actually catching the Tory party. And as we know from our electoral system, your ability to win seats really collapses once you get down to around 20%, which is where the Tories are. So, you know, it's going to make such a big difference in the next couple of days, just how badly they do.
Stuart?
Well, I've fought a lot of general elections over the years as a candidate and Member of Parliament. And this has got the feel of 2001 and 2005. It's not really caught the imagination. It was the second, 2001 was the second Blair victory. The turnout plummeted. People were not energised. They weren't that interested. Labour has been very, very cautious in their manifesto. And if you actually look at the polling figures, the weekend polls to the actual result, Labour's vote dropped by 5 or 6% in the last, with the exception of 2017, the last 5 or 6 general elections. They're only now polling about 38, 39%. So they could end up with just 35, 36%. They could get a lot of seats, but their support will be pretty shallow, even if it's wide.
Steve?
Well, I don't know why people are saying that they know the result when the votes haven't yet been cast. I've sat around for plenty of general elections hoping Labour is going to win and see the Tories sneak through at the end. A salutary reminder, this one, but just to draw level with the Conservatives, Labour needs the biggest swing that any party has had since the Second World War, bigger than Blair got in 1997. So why everyone is going around saying the election's over before people have voted, I do not know.
Why, Jo?
I think the polls have just dominated this election campaign, and I think the worry actually for people out there is so many people are just fed up. They're fed up with politics, they're fed up with feeling that things don't work, they're fed up with feeling that their voice doesn't really matter. And I think it's quite dangerous that the polls have been so dominant, because actually until people do go and cast their vote, there is no sort of result to talk of. And I think the idea that people are being swayed by polls in terms of how they potentially vote is problematic. I think we need people to remember they are voting for a local member of parliament. They should take a look at who that person is, and they should think seriously about whether they want that person to represent them. And if you don't like any of them, go and spoil your ballot and say what it is you want to say, but use the opportunity. The worst thing is that people sit at home and do nothing, because we're lucky to have a democratic right that you can exercise. We should make sure that people do.
Well, let's get a flavour of the mood on the campaign trails. Ian Watson, the BBC's political correspondent, has been following and is following Keir Starmer. Hello to you. Labour and the Labour leader have been out and about in the home counties, obviously setting their sights high in terms of Thursday.
Absolutely, Jo. I'm standing here, not a council estate in sight, right next to some fields in a pub beer garden in Buckinghamshire. This is not the sort of territory that Labour usually contest. They don't usually put resources into it. I've been speaking to some of the activists gathering here to listen to Keir Starmer, and they're saying that they're actually moving some resources into some very surprising seats, cabinet ministers' seats, which Labour would not have ever looked competitive in, not just in 2019, but even in 1997. We came from Hitchin, which was the first stop on this trail as well. There's been some boundary changes there, but again, by and large, not traditional Labour territory. What the party sources are saying is they're going to be concentrating this week on what they call battleground seats. And these are obviously, we knew from the beginning, they're not going to be defensive. They're going to go to Conservative-held seats, perhaps ones the party hadn't won since the Tony Blair era. But now they're going to ones which have been, in some cases, Conservative since 1906. So these are ones which they can consider battlegrounds. They may or may not win here, but that shows the scale of their ambition. So when you hear them saying they're not complacent, nobody's voted yet, of course they want to turn the opinion polls into actual votes, but this is a sign of their confidence.
Yes, well, Ian, funnily enough, Steve Reid, the Shadow Environment Secretary, has been saying exactly that in terms of the outcome on Thursday. Just briefly, I heard you ask Keir Starmer earlier about changes that people would feel or would notice if Labour win the election immediately. He wasn't that forthcoming, was he?
No, he wasn't. This is what I found interesting because, again, speaking to activists at our previous stop, some of them were saying they're finding it very difficult on the doorsteps. People were saying they still don't know who they're going to be voting for. Although, again, I stress this is in areas that aren't traditionally Labour. So I think what people wanted to hear is a real example of this change that Keir Starmer talks about. And he gave a very general answer to the question. It was all about Labour becoming a party of service again rather than party of specifics. The one thing he did mention specifically was all this extra overtime they're going to try to give to NHS workers to get those extra appointments he's promised. That does seem to be something which is on the cards, but I did ask him, I think, for 3 different things, and he didn't quite deliver on that. But I think what he's trying to say is he's going to change the mood, reignite hope, but I think there'll still be some voters out there saying change is great, but from what to what? Oh, and by the way, we should thank Steve Reid for giving us a pillow on the Labour campaign bus. This is the one with Rishi Sunak's face emblazoned on it, warning us not to wake up on the Friday morning with a Conservative government. But I think some people are actually putting these pillows to practical use as they are bussed around the home counties.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Good idea. Ian Watson, thank you very much. Jo mentioned the polls dominating this campaign. Well, let's have a look at the BBC poll tracker that we've been referring to regularly, because you can see how the polls have changed or not changed very much since the start of the year. On the right-hand side, you can see Labour and the Conservatives have dropped down a little bit, but still Labour has had that persistent 20-point lead. As Reform and to a lesser extent, the Lib Dems have gone up. But crucially, that lead that Labour has maintained is still there, and it looks in the final week of the campaign. So it looks as if Labour is on course for victory if those polls are actually borne out on Thursday. But whatever the result, what happens in the first days of an incoming government? In particular, what's going on inside government to prepare for those first days and months after an election? Well, who better to ask than a former civil servant and now director at the Institute for Government Alex Thomas. Welcome to you from the think tank, independent think tank, as I say, for effective government. Alex, lift the lid for us a little bit on what goes on inside government and what's going on right now, days before an election, to prepare for a possible change of government.
Yes, afternoon. Thanks for having me. I mean, the civil servants this week will be busily putting the finishing touches to their briefing that they've been working on for the last few weeks. There'll be a red set, a blue set, a yellow set, possibly a multicoloured set of briefings. So they'll be putting the finishing touches to that. They'll be particularly focusing on what in the civil service we tended to call the day one brief, so the bit of paper or the slide deck that an incoming Secretary of State and Minister might receive once they take office. That will focus on the really big decisions that are coming up, things that might hit the government in its early days, like there are discussions about whether Thames Water might be a big issue, or public sector pay deals, or some national security questions, and then also looking at the parties' manifestos, being ready to give the best advice they possibly can to ministers when they come into government, whether they're Labour or Conservative. It's also fair to say the civil servants will be following the polls quite closely as well, so they'll be preparing for different scenarios, but they will be conscious of the likelihood of an incoming Labour government.
But, does the civil service prepare literally for all eventualities? I mean, for example, at the start of the campaign, one of the eye-catching policies by the Conservatives was this idea of a new national service policy for all 18-year-olds. Would civil servants be working up a policy for that?
They would be on that. So they don't prepare for all eventualities, and actually it's been a feature of recent elections, 2010, 2015, 2017, that we didn't quite get the result that maybe we were expecting. So you use your judgment to work out what you should be preparing for. But on national service, yes, I think what they won't have been doing is going through the micro detail of the policy, actually drafting the legislation if it's needed and so on. They will have been getting in the best possible position to advise. So, what might be the constraints around that policy, around the armed services, for example? How much might it cost and how much might you budget for it? I mean, the other thing they'll be doing on the Labour side is thinking quite hard about what mission-driven government might mean. Labour have made quite a lot about this, quite a lot of this over the last few months, and it's interesting for a political party to put the how of doing government so front and centre of their campaign. So that, I know, has been a big focus of the civil service in recent weeks.
Right, well, we've got Steve Reed here, so stay with us for the moment. What have you been doing for mission-driven government, Steve? Because presumably, as a shadow minister, you've been meeting with civil servants to talk about your brief.
I've had a couple of conversations with civil servants about what the priorities for an incoming Labour government would be, but that's there in the manifesto. People can listen to what we've set out on the campaign trail. Genuinely, the vast majority of my focus has been on the Thursday the 4th, because we have to win before we can start thinking about governing. If we get over the line, we've got 5 years to start to turn this country around. Keir has been really clear what our first steps would be and the approach, the joined-up approach we would take to government, but none of that is possible unless we win. And there is this risk. If you over-prepare for being in government, you send a signal that the election's over when it isn't. And if people don't vote for change, there will be no change. People will wake up on Friday to Rishi Sunak.
Yep.
That pillow that I gave to Ian with Rishi Sunak's face on it was light-hearted, but it's a very serious message. You could wake up to Rishi Sunak on Friday. So I'm focused on Thursday, I'm afraid, not Friday.
Right, but how helpful has it been having meetings with civil servants? I mean, these are the things behind the scenes. The voters don't see it, do they?
Well, it's interesting to meet some of the people who, I mean, there's the two hurdles in the way. First, if we win, and secondly, if I'm appointed. It's good to know who those people would be, but they understand we're going to be focused on the campaign, not on the day after the campaign, because we haven't won yet.
Right, well, you can understand the cautiousness we are hearing from Steve Reed just days out from polling day. But Stuart, perhaps you can give us a little bit of insight or experience, your own personal experience in 2017 and what happened.
Well, obviously, it was quite a traumatic experience to lose your seat, and that might be the experience of a number of my former colleagues on Thursday, sadly. But just coming back to preparing for government, I discern a difference from the Blair era, because Blair had really worked hard for 2 or 3 years on preparing the ground in terms of policy. He had a very talented team behind him. He had his 5 pledges on his pledge card. And we don't really see that level of professionalism and polish. And obviously Starmer is not Tony Blair, with all due respect to Sir Keir Starmer. I think the key thing for Labour is how they translate the manifesto into a legislative programme, because there's going to be a bum fight as to which of the bills come before Parliament first. And I think, yes, civil servants can do their briefing, but ultimately it's a political decision on what the new government's priorities will be, because they've got to get those that legislation through Parliament.
Right. I mean, one of the biggest decisions, Alex, actually in 1997 was the decision to give independence to the Bank of England, and that caught everyone by surprise.
Certainly did, and the civil servants didn't know about that until after the election. Very, very few people did. So there was then a frantic period of work where they worked to understand how that policy would be implemented and so on. There will, it would be surprising if there weren't any surprises, if I can put it that way. So we will see what happens after Thursday. I do think this point about translating your policies and your manifesto into a programme for government is really important, though, and I think those prioritisation decisions that ministers will be taking, whichever party forms government, will be really important, and they're not easy. And I think one of the things I'd quite like to see is not just a King's speech on, I think, the 17th of July,
yes,
that's just a list of legislation, but something that really gives a sense of the programme for government and the way that the government is going to work over its 5-year term. So that those decisions you become path dependent. So those early decisions that ministers make in those first days and weeks are really, really important.
Harry?
Well, we know what the Labour Party's priorities are going to be because we have their 5 missions. So I don't think it's going to be a total surprise what they choose to focus on. I think Blair's interesting on this. Just last week he gave an interview talking about how to run a government, which has now become his speciality. And he was very clear that if you have ambitions but you don't have policies, you really have nothing. And I think that the problem with the Starmer programme is these missions are very vague. And so we are just waiting for the final moments. I think the other thing to just point out is, who's coming into government? You have Sue Gray, lifelong civil servant, at the centre of Keir Starmer's government.
If Labour win the election.
When they win the election. And what would be fascinating to see is how she goes about trying to change the civil service or get it to do what she wants in a way that, for instance, Steve Hilton and Dominic Cummings failed in.
Dominic Cummings under Boris Johnson and Steve Hilton under David Cameron, yeah.
Both came in as very antagonistic outsiders who wanted to remake the entire system. Sue Gray comes in as the consummate insider, so it'll be interesting to see if that works.
But interesting that people have talked about Sue Gray potentially having, grudges or sort of issues with folks that she might decide to play out when she goes into government if Labour do win. But on the other hand, to the point about whether Keir's vague or not about certain things, it's actually a pretty smart move to have put someone in as your chief of staff who actually does know a lot about the corridors. She knows Whitehall. That does mean that actually getting in and getting started, you are potentially a little bit further ahead than you might have been had you brought in people with far less experience. And
obviously a consummate civil servant in that sense. And arguably, Keir Starmer's previous role as Director of Public Prosecutions, this will lay the ground, will it, for smooth government?
Well, Sue Gray was sort of treated like the Wizard of Oz. She could do no wrong. She was the font of all wisdom when I was in government, which of course was nonsense, really. She was just another senior civil servant. But I do think the wider issue for Labour is they've put in place an architecture such as the human rights legislation, judicial reviews, etc., which will block some of their policies. Steve would have taken a view on, it sounds a bit obscure, the nutrient neutrality regulations, which have stopped mass house building and stymied the government's, this current government's house building targets. Labour are going to face the same issue around planning, EU regulations, as was, and NIMBYs.
Well,
they're going to, so that's going to be difficult.
What stopped mass house building is the Conservative Party, and what the Conservatives wanted to do, having failed to get their MPs to agree that we could build housing anywhere in this country, they decided to build it alongside polluted water estuaries so they could further pollute the already polluted water. That's what they were trying to lower environmental standards. They said they wouldn't lower during the Brexit negotiations, breaking promises again, failing to build houses. That's one of the reasons why people will need to vote for change on next Thursday, because we'll get 5 more years of this chaos if they're re-elected.
What are the things that would happen immediately, that people would notice a tangible difference? The question that Ian, my colleague, put to Sir Keir Starmer, if you win the election.
Well, Keir's outlined very clearly his first steps. And what he said is these are the first steps in the broader missions that Labour would be. What
would that be? What would you notice? What would you notice? What would be the first things that you might do?
The King's speech will be very important on the 17th, because whoever wins the election, that's when they will be outlining their legislative programme. But I think people will really notice it on the Friday morning if there is a different Prime Minister in this country leading a different kind of government. I think it would give the country a psychological boost, because they would see that change is possible and that the people that have created, well, it's in our manifesto, it's in the 6 first steps that have been very clearly outlined. It's an end to this, 5 prime ministers, 7 chancellors since 2016, crashing the economy, breaking the National Health Service. This is a country crying out for change. In my brief, every single river in this country is polluted, and we will put the water companies under tough special measures to put an end to it. Now, that's not going to take too long to bring in, but people will see change if they vote for it on the 4th next week.
How big will sentiment be, do you think, before these changes come, if Labour is successful?
You mean how useful will it be that the new governments come in, they can sort of change the mood of the country? Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. But I think one thing that's also happening, which we're not quite touching on, which I think is really interesting for journalism, is if you live under essentially a one-party state, which is what we're at risk of with the result on Thursday, the power that's wielded by the Labour Party is extraordinary, and their ability to prevent scrutiny of them in the papers is actually pretty extraordinary, because editors, reporters feel constrained in reporting on the one party that has power. And I think you saw the same thing in '97 leading up to the Iraq War, where Alistair Campbell had a sort of almighty power over the press. And my only concern, like many people, I think change is necessary ahead of the election, but if you only have one party having 70% of the seats in the House of Commons, there's a real stifling effect on the way we scrutinise that party.
But it's also a changed party that still has elements in it that don't all get on. And so the reality is, it's not as if it's just going to be one happy ship with everyone moving in one direction. The interesting point, straight after you win an election, is you appoint people. People don't get what they want. Their advisors don't necessarily get jobs. There's lots of sort of shenanigans that go on. And then, of course, there's going to be a group of people who feel that they're part of this, they're riding the crest of a wave, but then they feel powerless because they're not in the top jobs. And so actually, keeping that sort of show on the road is actually a very difficult part of then governing, which Keir Starmer will potentially face.
The Chief Whip's job will be probably the hardest job in the Labour government.
Well, I mean, it's often the hardest job.
And with lots of new inexperienced MPs, we are going to have an incredible... We are losing, whether you like them or not, folks, there's a lot of experience that we are losing with this election. A lot of people that have stood down on all sides. And actually, it's great we've got new people, new energy, but also there is going to be a period where everyone's trying to find out where the toilets are, getting their offices set up. It doesn't mean everything's going to happen.
But there's also a lot of new experience coming in. I've been up and down the country. I won't name the candidates because I know you don't have to name everyone else.
Thank you. But you to think of us and the programme. Well done. Yeah.
But we've got some people coming in with extraordinary experience across all walks of life in this country. What a benefit to Parliament to have that energy coming in and have that fresh thinking coming in. I think it will help the country.
Or everyone will be exhausted. But anyway, that aside, that's my age. Alex, just before we let you go, in terms of things that can happen quickly or things that you can cancel quickly, if Labour did win and does win on Thursday, scrapping the Rwanda scheme, for example, which has been so central to the Conservatives, is that done with the sort of whip of a pen or not?
Well, you would need to legislate to remove the legislation, but it's in the government's gift to not send any flights. So you would just expect that not to happen. Then make an announcement early doors, I expect, and then follow that up with legislation in due course. Although I expect they will want to, when they do remove that legislation, they'll want to have an alternative in place. So that's one of those choreography questions that you do. The other really big decision is about the budget and the spending review. So we're not expecting a budget before the summer, but then presumably there will be one in the autumn. Rachel Reeves has said she wants to kind of follow the process with the Office of Budget Responsibility on that. And then there's a huge decision about whether they do a 1-year spending review or a 3-year spending review without getting too techie, but they'll have to make all those decisions right at the start.
Alex Thomas, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to catch up with the Conservative campaign bus in just a moment in those last few days of campaigning. But before we do, Stuart, can I just get your thoughts? Because the tone of the campaign, the Conservative campaign, had been very much about this supermajority. Don't let Labour have unchecked power. It changed at the weekend because he turned his attack, as did other cabinet ministers, onto reform following that racist slur and disgraceful language by a canvasser for reform. Do you think they should have been more assertive about reform earlier?
No, because I just think that people aren't listening to attacks on reform, frankly, from the Conservative Party. They're just not. They don't believe a lot of the things that are being said about, Russian bots and, the parties shot through with racism, people are expecting them to say that. I don't think it's had a big impact. I do think that history teaches us that if you go to the electorate and say, we're going to get marmalised on Thursday, but please don't marmalise us too much because the other guys will be too powerful, probably not the most persuasive argument. It didn't work in 1983 with Francis Pym saying, Thatcher would have too big a majority, for instance. My regret is that the Conservative Party at the highest level has not put a more positive campaign on things like education, the reforms in education, the difficulties we've had. Now, people never give you any praise for seeing through the rough times, but, COVID and Ukraine have been exceptionally difficult issues. And obviously the after glow of Brexit as well has been a very difficult issue for the party. But I think a more positive campaign would have won more voters back from Reform and maybe stop people going for the Labour Party.
All right.
But I'd say in the end of it, the British people are very fair. They do generally tend to say 14, 15 years, you've had your time, give the other guy a chance.
OK, well, let's find out what the mood has been like on the Conservative campaign. And the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, we can talk to Nick Eardley, the BBC's political correspondent. Hello to you, Nick. What's it been like?
Hi, Jo. I'm quite struck, actually. I spent the first 48 hours of the campaign with Rishi Sunak, back for the final 72 hours. And, there's no doubt it's a different vibe. Back then, Rishi Sunak was running around full of beans, telling everybody that he had a chance of turning this around. He is still saying, look, I'm fighting for every vote. But the language that really struck me in the speech that he just gave in Staffordshire was when he said you can vote Conservative to stop a Labour supermajority. The Conservatives are not publicly anyway conceding that they're not going to win the general election, but I think that's probably a reflection from Rishi Sunak of where things are at, the vote he's fighting for. And it seems pretty clear that in the last 72 hours, there are two groups. When you speak to Tory candidates, there are two groups that they are vying to try and win over. One, disaffected Conservatives who are moving over to Reform in parts of the country like the Midlands, where a lot of candidates are really worried that they're hemorrhaging votes to Reform. They're hoping they can win some of those people back. The other group that you hear candidates of all parties actually talk about a lot is undecideds. I'm told by people from various parties there are still a lot of voters who are saying they've not quite made up their minds when canvassers are chapping on their doors. So that, I think, is who Rishi Sunak is targeting. We just had a huddle with him where everybody sits round and asks questions, and he was like, look, I am absolutely fighting for this. This is not a done deal. He used a metaphor comparing himself to, not comparing himself, let me correct, he was asked whether he could do a Jude Bellingham and win things at the very last minute, and he said, look, it's not over until it's over. But some of the optimism that you saw in the Conservative campaign in the first 48 hours, a bit harder to detect now.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much. Reflecting there, our thoughts at the top of the programme. Jo, can I just show you the front page of the Daily Express, continuing the conversation with Stuart Jackson, Kemi Badenoch. My heart breaks when Tories turn to Reform there on the front page. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it's this plea that, don't go to them, stay with us. But the problem is, to Stuart's point, it's not even just about having a more positive campaign. It was having a positive campaign of any nature at all. I mean, it's just been constantly about what everyone else will do or the risk of everyone else without actually putting forward what you are getting by voting Conservative. And I think that's been actually part of the problem that lots of people have said all along. No one knows what Rishi Sunak stands for. No one really has known what Rishi Sunak would do, could do, even while in office. And so I think the challenge has been, is it about people? Is it about the party hemorrhaging support to Reform because people feel Reform are talking a language that they identify with? Or is it just because they're saying something when the Tories aren't saying anything at all other than don't vote for anyone else? So I think there is a problem that with elections you have to offer something. And I think that is a real problem for people that would have traditionally voted Tory because they don't know what they're going to get. All they know is they don't like what they've just had. But they don't know what they're going to get if they do vote Tory. They just keep being told, don't vote for anyone else. And I don't think that really works in elections.
I think, look, if Rishi Sunak was good at being Prime Minister, he would have proved that over the last 2 years. He would have given people something to vote for. It's very late in the day to be saying, hey, don't vote for reform, I'm going to be good. I mean, he's had an unbelievably good opportunity to prove what he would do in the last 2 years. And he hasn't done anything to recover the Tory party's position in the polls. So I think it's very late in the day for him to be making references to world-class footballers.
Well, and also we've got this headline from Jesse Norman, interestingly, a candidate at the election, former minister, the Daily Telegraph. A rushed Tory leadership contest would not be in the interests of the party or the country. Is he right, Stuart?
Well, he's very smart and erudite, Jesse Norman. I wouldn't want to criticise him. He's a man of letters. But yeah, he is right in that the party needs to reflect what may be, if the polls are right, a very significant historic defeat. And the idea that it's business as usual and you can rush to the first person, whether it's Kemi Badenoch or Tom Tugendhat's been mentioned and others, I just don't think that will wash. They need to really think through a long process. One of the things is the candidates department and the whole way Conservative Central Office has worked is not worked. It's been suboptimal. And I do think the party needs to reflect long and hard on why it hasn't had better cut through in the campaign.
All right, well, let's talk about energy because GB Energy is one of the key proposals from Labour. But let's have a look at this headline. BBC News, energy prices fall, but relief may be temporary. Yes, a drop in domestic gas and electricity prices has now taken effect, but costs are expected to rise again in October. Now, the regulator Ofgem's new price cap for England, Wales and Scotland came into force today, meaning a typical household's energy bill will fall by £122 a year. This is the Labour Party manifesto, set up Great British Energy, number 4 in terms of the missions, a publicly owned clean power company to cut bills for good and boost energy security paid for by a windfall tax on oil and gas giants. What is Great British Energy, Steve?
It's an energy generating company, and this is one of the big changes that Labour will make if we win the general election, because GB Energy will be set up, paid for by that windfall tax, and it will lead investment in wind, wave, solar, nuclear energy so that we can transition our country from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy, and by doing that, cut bills for the long term as well as create jobs up and down this country.
Right, but
a transformational offer.
Right. It looks transformational on paper, but it's not drilling for oil and gas and pumping energy into people's homes, is it?
No, it will be
how's it
generating and wind, wave, solar.
How?
By investing in wind, wave, solar and nuclear. It will be generating it itself, and it will be working in partnership with private companies that will be doing the same. It will then sell that energy to the energy retailers who sell us the energy in our homes, but it will be cheaper. So it's in 2021, the price cap was, an average price was £1,100 today, it's £1,500. If we have GB Energy online by 2030 and it achieves what it's setting out to do, energy bills on average will be £300 less that year and every single year moving forward. So that's how we cut energy.
By 2030?
The ambition is to become a clean energy superpower by 2030. That is an ambitious target. We know it's challenging, but Sir Patrick Vallance, the chief exec of Octopus Energy Company, the House of Commons Climate Committee have all said that is achievable. So that is the ambition that we'll be working towards.
How do you attract that investment?
Well, it will be done through the company itself. It will be set up as a company. It will be investing in those kinds of forms of energy generation.
Subsidising them?
No, investing in them, investing in them and then selling it. So it will make a return on the investment that it makes. Well, but it's much cheaper to generate clean energy than to import energy from abroad when the energy markets are so volatile and when prices can go up because of the behaviours of foreign dictators like Vladimir Putin. So in a way, we take back control of our energy instead of being in hock to foreign dictators, and we cut bills at the same time and create jobs. It's a fantastic policy.
What can go wrong is what you're going to ask me.
Yeah. No ambition.
Well, that's what can go wrong. You've got an ambition, but no policy. Actually, our policy has been to reduce carbon emissions, and we've been incredibly successful in that.
What about cutting bills? What about cutting bills? How would you cut bills?
The Ukraine war has obviously had a big impact on energy prices,
but they've got an answer.
The problem with the Labour Party is they are going to wreck oil and gas because they're not going to put any more money into that and not support it, and they're going to tax it. They're still going to have the problem of fundamental change in terms of planning. They've got to get all this through planning. They've got to get significant amounts of capital expenditure into these industries. They're going to be picking winners, which is never a good thing. Nationalisation, effectively, of the energy industry
No,
by picking winners.
No,
Blair wouldn't have done it. Mandelson wouldn't have done it, but they're going to do it. And I think actually they should concede that the Conservatives have done a good job on, say, offshore wind, and they should be more incremental. And the idea that you can get the whole of the grid net zero by 2030 is ludicrous.
So you think Sir Patrick Vallance, you know more than Sir Patrick Vallance or the Chief Executive of Octopus?
Is Sir Patrick Vallance
the Chief Executive of Octopus Energy?
Well,
you know more about energy than the chief exec of one of the country's biggest energy companies.
But it's very telling. You say it's an ambition, not a policy. Well, we've all got ambition.
It's an ambition with a policy to deliver it. What we've got here is a party with zero ambition for this country, and that is why the choice on the 4th will be between ambition for Britain or 5 more years of the same chaos.
Your talking points
energy
are not
bills
going to
rising
answer
and
the key
rising year after
question.
year.
Steve, your talking points are not going to answer the key question: how you're going to get to net zero. The grid is a very complex beast. Oil and gas employs a lot of people that you're going to wreck capital investment.
No, we're not. There's many more jobs to be had in clean energy than in fossil energy.
And the reason we have been able to expand onshore and offshore wind, solar energy and nuclear to a certain extent
is because... There's been no new onshore wind given planning permissions since 2015.
Well,
that is the poverty of your ambition, Stuart.
No, because some of your members of Parliament and Liberal Democrats have consistently in Parliament said they want cheaper energy, and then they've gone to the constituencies and say we don't want infrastructure.
So you've got a majority and you can't get anything through Parliament. That's how chaotic you are. I mean, it just says it all.
It's not chaotic. Look, it's your legal infrastructure. It's your Human Rights Act. It's your environment. European Court of Human Rights.
It really is a joke.
You have set out that architecture
How long have you been in government, Stuart?
A lot of.
How many years? 14?
Well, on our own, 9 years.
9 years.
9 years.
Isn't it enough for the Tories to do anything?
No,
there you go.
But
we can have 5 more years of that incompetent chaos.
I will support you if you want to deliver lower bills and sustainability. But all I'm saying to you is be realistic about the timescale.
Well,
because I don't think you'll do it by 2030.
Well, hang on. If Stuart's going to support you and the timescale is what he's sceptical about, can you today say again that you can guarantee bills will come down, people's household bills will come down by 2030 of up to £300 a year?
It is an ambition, and I recognise it's a challenging ambition, but we've got the Chief Executive of Octopus Energy, who knows probably more about the energy markets even than Stuart here,
well, he's
who
one
says that is achievable. But in order to do it, you have to outline the ambition and then put in place the policies that are going to get you there. If you just say, oh, this country is incapable of doing anything, let's watch it decline, that, I'm afraid, is the Tory vision for Britain. Labour will be a little bit more ambitious.
Right, let's show you the City AM headline, Jo and Harry. UK can't afford not to go green in bid for growth. So says the chief of the Confederation of Business Industry. Do you agree with her?
I'm not sure if it's about the green point, but I think the point about government taking a more active role in the energy market is probably the way forward, because I think there is a sense out there that energy prices, the sense that these companies have made more money and not done enough to actually look at the transition for the country, I think is something that people are frustrated around. And I think we hear repeatedly about lack of investment in certain industries because government gets in the way. There are local issues, to Stuart's point about planning. And generally, there's often a sense that the civil service is risk averse. And, Lord Richard Harrington wrote a big report last year, which was all about how you get more investment in. And he said there's a huge gap into, I think it was 50 billion he quoted, that we could get from companies that want to make a difference. They want to invest in the UK. And actually, we sort of shoot ourselves in the foot because we make it more and more difficult. So actually having something that's quite ambitious and has real government backing is probably a smart move. Whether or not the 2030 target is realistic, of course, there's always going to be challenges. And asking anyone to guarantee when we've just come off of, the war in Ukraine and all the and COVID, etc. It would be foolish for anyone to say, I guarantee it. But I think you do want to get a sense that this isn't just a woolly policy. We have somewhere we want to get to and we have an aim, I think is probably the right approach. But, of course, there will be a million excuses as to why it doesn't happen. If it doesn't happen, there'll be lots of reasons that will come up. But I do think having some more ambition and looking at things like that report and saying, government's actually got to put its shoulder to the wheel and make stuff happen. It's got to drive stuff through. And maybe that is the way that we will see a big change for the UK.
I mean, Labour have pledged to stop granting any further licences for oil and gas exploration if they win the election. Does that make the transition more difficult then from oil and gas to a greener economy with that target of 2030 rather than 2035?
I think it's completely necessary. You know, politics is the only thing now stopping us from getting where we need to go on the grid. The National Grid themselves say we can get to 100% soon. And I think government is a conspiracy for inertia. And so you have to have priorities like these. And this is really a signalling mechanism. You know, it's for the private sector to do this, but this is a good signalling mechanism to have.
All right. Well, now, throughout the election campaign, we've been looking at how it's been playing out on social media. Our disinformation correspondent, Mariana Spring, has been following the campaign through the social media feeds of 24 undercover voters, fictional characters she's created representing different types of voters around the UK. Most recently, Mariana, you can see there, hello to you, investigating the rise of accidental election influencers on social media. Well, let's speak to her. She's in the BBC's Verify studio. What are accidental influencers, Mariana?
So accidental influencers are essentially people who've gone viral this election and really didn't anticipate that they would for their political content. And I think this speaks to a wider trend I've been seeing. Obviously, there's lots of content coming from the parties themselves, both paid for political adverts that they target at particular people, and also the content that they're creating that's not paid for or paid to target at people in the same way, but that's being recommended on people's feeds. But alongside that, I've seen a lot of content that's being pushed from profiles that otherwise hadn't gone viral before, often young people based around the UK. So some of the people I chatted to were aged from about 15 up until about 31. And what I've noticed is on my undercover voters feeds, the characters you mentioned that have these social media profiles that are private and with no friends, but allow me to see what different people are being pushed. I've found that about 90% of the political posts they're being recommended are coming from these unofficial accounts, from people who've decided they want to get involved. And that is a really good thing. It can encourage younger people to voice their opinions. And a lot of the updates are reliable. But the flip side is that with great virality comes great responsibility. And a lot of the content that's been recommended has also been misleading or false. And that can be a bit of a problem, particularly as polling day approaches.
Now, you've tracked down some of these accidental influencers. What did you find out?
So I had some really interesting conversations, and I should say that these influencers sit across the political spectrum. So I chatted to people who are both supportive of left-leaning parties and right-leaning ones as well. I chatted to a 15-year-old called Tory. She lives in London. She decided to post about how she was concerned about some of the rhetoric around immigration that politicians were using. She put her phone on charge, went to bed, woke up, and her TikTok had absolutely blown up. And she was really surprised about the number of views and likes she'd had. I spoke to another 16-year-old called Will. He has posted lots of clips about, for example, politicians supporting Brexit, has racked up hundreds of thousands of views, and even has made a political logo for his profile. There are others I chatted to who've actually been in touch with the political parties. One who said that they'd spoken to Labour about some of their content that they'd been sharing, but that they hadn't been paid in any way, and that there was no kind of official relationship in terms of their content. Quite a few of these people have told me that other users have messaged them to say, well, your post actually did impact me or influence me in some way. And there are a few of them who actually regretted some of the stuff that had gone viral, wished that they'd added more context, and were worried that actually, for example, claims they'd made about tactical voting or predictions they'd made could be misleading and unhelpful.
Right. Well, Mariana Spring, thank you very much for all of that detail. And of course, we are in the final few days of the campaign. I don't know what your social media feeds have been like, Steve Reed and Stuart Jackson. Busy, I should...
Busy, but sadly not yet viral. I'd love to be a viral political social media influencer. The chance
I was going to say, it might be...
I'm sure you're viral in Croydon, Steve.
But, I mean, it's been a much more digital election than any I've been in before. You know, we've all been making digital content in a way that we haven't before, locally and on national issues. So it's a different
Thank you to all of our guests and from us here. Bye-bye. I'll be back tomorrow.
You are in a lot of debt.
Mama.